Hello, I'm David Cohen. I'm an interventional cardiologist that work at the Cardiovascular Research Foundation and St. Francis Hospital here in New York. And it's my pleasure to have good friend and longtime colleague, Dr. Mark Hlatky, on today with us to discuss a paper that is they just are publishing in JACC. Mark is the professor of health policy as well as a professor of medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And for those of you who don't know, Mark has been one of the real pioneers of cost effectiveness analysis in the cardiovascular space for I don't want to say how long, Mark. I'll just leave it at that. One of the pioneers for it, and we're going to be talking about the economic study that was done alongside the FAME-3 trial. Mark, welcome.
David, thank you. It's a pleasure to see you and talk to you, and you know this field very well yourself, having done similar studies.
A little too well, perhaps. So let's just start with a basic motivation question. Tell us a little bit about why you and Bill Furon and the team felt this was an important study to do. Why do an economic study in the FAME-3 trial?
Well, actually, let me go back to the very beginning of all this, David, if you'll indulge me, because this started out for me when I was starting my career, and I was involved in another trial of bypass surgery and angioplasty, the Barry trial. One of the first generation of trials that looked at this with just plain balloon angioplasty and so on. And we were organizing the study, and I said, gosh, we need to measure. We expect that people are going to do just as well. It's going to be a tie clinically between PCI and CABG. So we need to know about other things like the economic outcomes, how much does it cost, how quickly to get back, and so on. And that's the key thing. So we organized a study of doing that, bypass surgery versus angioplasty, called it SEQUEL, Study of Economics and Quality of Life. And I published that, I will say, 30 years ago. And we're still asking the same questions because PCI and CABG continue to evolve. And so back then, we found that CABG was more cost-effective than PCI was. And then as things evolved, that we've gone through stents and drug-eluting stents and so on. And so there were newer generations of stents, and they showed that it was actually cost more money in the long run to do bypass surgery, but it seemed to be worth it because people were living longer. And so at the beginning of this study, we said, well, we'll need to look at that in FAME-3. And so that was the motivation for doing this. And we did 5 years because that seems like it's a long enough time to figure out what's going on and whether there's going to be any long-term effects of the two procedures.
Well, I think you did start the whole thing. I guess you're right. 30 years ago with Barry, and a lot of our work in the stent space carried it forward through the Syntax and the Freedom and the Excel trials. And here we are now, 30 years later, with FAME-3. So tell us, first of all, remind us what FAME-3 was studying, because it was not just a stent. It was more than just a stent, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is that contemporary revascularization and medical therapy has improved overall. We have better therapies. We're smarter about picking patients. FAME-3 in particular looked at not just PCI guided by the visual appearance of the lesions, but by fractional flow reserve to see which ones looked bad but really were impeding blood flow, and focusing the revascularization on those lesions. They also used newer drug-eluting stents, and everybody got extremely good medical therapy. So that was in both arms. And so those are the main differences between this and prior ones. But if I were to put my finger on one thing, I think it's the FFR guidance.
Right. That's what differed between this study and the ones that I did previous to this, which was, that was the main addition there. So tell us what you did and what you found.
This was done alongside the clinical trial, which is the way we've been doing these things for a while now. And so we collected economic outcomes and quality of life outcomes at the regular visits during the study, 1 month, 6 months, 12 annual intervals, and captured any use of important resources like repeat procedures being the most important, any other complications, and so on. And in our part of the study, we figured out what the economics of those things were. We assigned Medicare costs to the use of things like bypass or repeat procedures and so on. So we used the Medicare fee schedule, which is a very important payer in the U.S. and kind of a standard to use. And we also used the quality of life using the EuroQol system, because we had some European countries too involved in this. And so we measured those at regular intervals, and then we compared them. And we looked at results over 5 years. And then we also did a projection, a lifetime projection of cost effectiveness. And there's two reasons for this. One is that cost effectiveness can understate the value of things if there's longer term benefit from the procedure than the end of your trial. So if your trial lasts 2 years and you have a whole bunch of people who are living for 20, you're not capturing the whole rest of their survival experience. So you need to look at that in long-term projections. And so we added that part to it. And the other part of that is we knew that you and your group did that with the other studies that you mentioned, the syntax and so on. And it was by looking at those long-term projections that you and others had concluded that CABG was cost effective. And so we wanted to follow that way of doing things so that we can compare our results with yours.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and it's part of the reason why the recommendations continue to be to, unless you have reason to believe that all the action has stopped after 5 years, looking beyond is important, even if there's a lot of uncertainty there, which there obviously will always be. So what did you find, and how did that compare with what I've found previously and in the last 20 years or so?
So the first thing is that we found that the costs of the PCI patients were lower over 1 year, 5 years, and even in the lifetime projections. This is completely consistent with what you found, everybody else found, back what I found 30 years ago. It's the same story, is that PCI costs less money. So that was an uncontroversial thing, but what we needed to do was like by how much. And so we did measure exactly how much better it was. It's about 30% over 5 years difference between the two procedures. And so you're paying more for bypass surgery. And the question is, what are you getting for all that extra money? And what we found in FAME-3, which is different than what was found in some of the previous studies, was that the survival after over 5 years was basically exactly the same in the two arms. And because it was the same in the two arms, there was no extra life years. The way that you measure it in the cost effectiveness is to look at how long people are living and whether they're having better quality of life. So it's quality adjusted life years. And so the qualities were very, very, very close in the two groups. There was a slight edge to PCI, very slight, over 5 years. But the big point was for CABG to be cost effective, it would have had to be the big winner. So we're about to play the World Series here. Tie goes to the runner. Tie here goes to the cheaper one, which is PCI. But the question was, well, what about the long term? Other studies have found, there's a late advantage. When we did our projections, it didn't change anything. And the simple reason is that there were no extra survivors. So there was nobody collecting those extra quality adjusted life years in the CABG arm to justify the higher price. So to me, it was a very simple and intuitive answer, which is that, even though we did a lot of fancy modeling, it was just to make sure that we're not misleading ourselves by looking only at a short period of time and shortchanging CABG. So we looked over the long run, and we didn't see that. So here it is. Here's this study is different from the ones that like Syntax and Freedom and Excel, in that we showed that PCI was favored economically with pretty high reliability in the two arms.
Some people would call that economically dominant. I know that's it's a tricky word. It's certainly cheaper, and it's and the outcomes are similar. So that some people could call that economically dominant. I'm not sure how you feel about it.
That's a little bit of jargon for the usual the listeners here, is that whatever one of them is if something gives you better results at a lower price, you go for it. You don't need a lot of fancy analysis to say you go for it. And in most of the time when we looked at this in our bootstrap replications of our models, we found that this the PCI was favored at the currently accepted cost effectiveness threshold. Whichever one you might want to pick, it was better for the PCI group.
No, it's remarkable. So do you have any, this is outside of the economic realm, but it's on the clinical realm of, so, why did PCI get better? Why did PCI catch up? What's going on here?
I think that, people have just gained experience with it, and we're better at picking patients the right way. I mean, one of the things to say is that our statement only refers to people who would be like the people in our study. And, the people who have very, very severe disease wouldn't be considered for this trial, because we know that they would do better with CABG. And similarly, people with very limited disease would all go to PCI. We wouldn't recommend CABG for them, so they're out too. And it's only the people where there's sort of equipoise, people could say, well, we could go either way, either PCI. And so that's the group that we looked at. We're not saying that in all circumstances that PCI is more cost effective than CABG this way, only in this group of people, and when the PCI was done this way.
And these are people who, again, the investigators felt that they could do an equally good job with either form of revascularization. I think that probably is the main point there. It's so your certainly does not apply to the universe of patients with three vessel coronary disease. That's for sure. What about diabetics? So diabetics has been a bugaboo for PCI for a long time. It came out again from the Barry trial, first trial, and then the Freedom trial again showed, even with drug-eluting stents, that we could not, that bypass surgery had a mortality advantage at 5 years that continued out to 10 years. Did you look at that at all here?
I didn't look at it closely, and I don't think we had a lot of people with diabetes in the study, so it'd be very hard. I'm going back to the original part, which is that anybody who we thought that there was a clear survival advantage with one technique would not have been considered eligible. So the people who everybody would agree need bypass were not in our study. As I look at the long arc of this, one of the things about this is you say, well, you guys have been looking at the same question here for the last 30 years. Can't you figure the damn thing out? Am I allowed to say that on this?
You could say it. I would say it that way.
Okay. So can't we get the answer? And one of the reasons we can't is that we keep tweaking the technique. The bypass surgery of 2025 is not the same as bypass surgery in 1995, and the same, even more so, for PCI. And so the results evolve, and this is the moving target problem is a big one in our field, because we're not going to stand still.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say, condense that all down into, you can either have long-term results or you can have modern technology, but you can't really have both in a study. It's very hard to get both because nobody stands still with this. Let me ask one
Right.
final question. Just go ahead, Mark. I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry
I,
about that.
I was just going to say there's no substitute. You can't following, 10 patients for 1 year is not the same as following one patient for 10 years. So even if you have a lot of data, if you don't have long-term data, we don't know. The other thing I'd say though is I don't think we're likely to see big surprises in the long-term follow-up of these folks. I think that we've seen that it's not like everybody who had a stent all of a sudden falls apart after 9 years or something.
No, the
Um,
curves. I mean, I actually think 5 years actually at some level is where cabbage looks the best it's going to look. Because the vein grafts are generally still functioning. The lima is going to function for a very good long time for it. And so I think, the data that we have now looking at 10-year follow-up of PCI versus cabbage trials, there's not a lot of movement. I mean, things may come a little bit closer together. They don't separate more, at least not any of the studies that have been done in the last 2 decades. Let me ask one final question, just because a lot of our audience may be in other countries,
yes.
and other countries, and a lot of the patients in this study were enrolled in other countries. So what do you think about other countries? I know you don't have the data there, but can you make just some generalizations other than we don't know as well as we do here?
Um, the thing I would say is that the thing that changes the most likely between countries would be the costs of these things. People have looked at it, and in general, bypass surgery costs more than PCI does in almost every healthcare system. And it's basically, if you just look at the resources that are used, you need to spend more time in the hospital, you need bigger teams, and so on. And those things are true everywhere. So I wouldn't think it would change much. The one exception would be if you're in a healthcare system where importing the stents and all the material you need for PCI is a lot more expensive than just having your surgical team. So the relative costs of PCI
Yeah.
and CABG might be a little different in certain environments, but I think most of the healthcare systems that we have in Europe and so on, it's pretty much the same.
The cost of the stents these days is almost nominal compared to everything else. The stents have gotten so good, and they're so much of a commodity that
Yeah.
they're nowhere near as expensive as they were 20 years ago when they first came out. So that's almost a drop in the bucket these days. Well, I think this has been again a terrific discussion, and I think it is really remarkable that your most of your career has spanned this field of research. So maybe you can close the book on this for a while and open
Well,
another book.
it's been a good source of investigation for many many years, and I do think we can get some principles back out of it. Is one of the things to me is not just knowing the answer, but getting the insights. And the insight is that if you're going to have a more expensive procedure, you need to have, and it costs 30-40% more. You need to get some better results
And I
to
gotta have some
justify
bang.
extra cost.
I
Yeah, and
couldn't agree
the
more.
biggest thing is making people live longer. So that's the most important thing. And if you have a survival advantage, you can almost always figure out a way to make it cost effective in some people.
In some people, I guess, unless you charge, hundreds of $1,000s a year for the drug or something like that, which
Well,
sometimes happens these days.
exactly. The healthcare system can negotiate the price, but it's
Can't negotiate the benefit. Well, again, I
no.
think this has been a terrific discussion. I want to congratulate you and Bill and the whole FAME group of investigators on another terrific study, and for kind of rounding it out with the quality of life and economic piece, which is favorites of mine from it. I hope that our audience has gotten a lot out of this as well. I encourage you to read the whole paper and the appendices if you were very deeply interested in the field. But I think Mark summed it up very well. As you got to have some real bang if you're going to get bang for your buck. And here at this point with these technologies, PCI and bypass surgery seem to have very similar long-term outcomes. So let's go for the cheaper one. That's not hard math. Again, thanks again, Mark, for coming on. Thanks to all our audience for listening. Thanks to JACC for publishing this and giving it some strong press. And we will see you again very soon. Take care.
Thanks a lot, David.